In a recent video, I discussed William Polk's book, Crusade and Jihad, the 1,000-Year War between the Muslim world and the Global North. Keyword, 1,000-Year War. And although it is, as you can see, a mighty tome containing 550 pages, and although it claims to cover 1,000 years, most of those years of conflict from 634, when Islam really first invaded Western Christian lands, to the 1800, when it went on the retreat, received only some 30 pages of coverage, as we saw. In other words, those 12 centuries which saw Muslims conquer most of Christendom's original territory and invade more, with all the attendant massacres and destruction and enslavement, despoliation of churches, converting them into mosques, etc., received a few sanitized pages, mostly alluding to how Islam spread through trade and the glories of Al-Andalus. If you haven't seen that video, link in description. So what is the rest of his book about? In fact, about 520 of its 550 pages, that is to say 95% of the book, is confined to the last 2 centuries, when Europe ceased being on the defensive and went on the offensive against Islam. Here, Polk meticulously describes in vivid and hyperbolic detail every conceivable sin the West committed against the Muslims. Here's a quote. Beginning at various times after Christopher Columbus led the way across the Atlantic and the Portuguese plunged down the West African coast, the actions of the North have been uniformly destructive and sometimes genocidal. The first cause of the danger and insecurity, he's referring to Islamic terrorism today, we feel today is the long history of imperialism. A century or more of invasion, occupation, humiliation, and genocide from the West to Muslims has left scars that are still not healed and cannot heal if they are constantly reopened. Of course, having whitewashed the first millennium of jihad on the West, as he does, it's easy for Polk to make Europeans appear as the unprovoked aggressors, greedy monsters come to destroy the glories of Islam. Yet he fails to mention that Columbus sailed west precisely because the Mediterranean was an Islamic terror zone, with Turkic Ottomans and Egyptian Mamluks slaughtering and enslaving any Christian that got into their hands. And he presents Russian expansion into Tatar regions as a merciless enterprise without explaining that the Tatars, known in Russian chronicles as the heathen giant who feeds on our blood, terrorized and enslaved Russians for centuries earlier. As more balanced historians, such as Bernard Lewis, have explained, quote, the whole complex process of European expansion and empire, he's referring to the colonial era, has its roots in the clash of Islam and Christendom. It began with a long and bitter struggle of the conquered peoples of Europe in East and West to restore their homelands to Christendom and expel the Muslim peoples who had invaded and subjugated them. It was hardly to be expected that the triumphant Spaniards and Portuguese would stop at the Straits of Gibraltar, or that the Russians would allow the Tatars to retire in peace and regroup in their bases on the upper and lower Volga, the more so since a new and deadly Muslim attack on Christendom was already underway. The victorious liberators, having reconquered their own territories, pursued their former masters, the Muslims, whence they had come. Such is the start of the colonial era. Regardless, Polk habitually harps on how, quote, memories, so this is Polk talking now, quote, memories of Western imperialism are deep among Muslims, and they helped create much of the world's disorder and danger today. Terrorism. The humiliation and wholesale massacres of populations carried out by European imperialists, though largely forgotten by the perpetrators, the West, remain today vivid to the descendants of the victims. As such, every Islamic terror group, including the Islamic State, ISIS, are the products of the anger and frustration of Muslims, which has its roots, according to Polk and others, in the colonial era. Again, one need only look to real history, not fake history, to appreciate the folly of his deterministic reading, which sees Muslims as the perpetual victims of a fake history. After a millennium of actual European victimhood, a millennium of Muslim invasions that saw the conquest of 3/4 of Christendom's original territory, the enslavement of 5 million Europeans between just the 15th and 18th centuries at the hands mostly of Barbary pirates, the Tatars, the aforementioned Tatars, and the Ottomans, And after the slaughter of untold millions, backwards Europe still managed to rise triumphant and without any apologies or appeasement from Muslims. Why can't Islam? Could it be that its problems are intrinsic and have nothing to do with the purported sins of Europe? For instance, in Polk's chapter, Somalia, the failed state, imperialism is again cited as the blame-all. Yet, in 1855, decades before Europeans colonized it, the adventurer Richard Burton described Somalia in very unappealing terms, adding that Somalis are, quote, extremely bigoted, especially against Christians, and are fond of jihading, unquote. Today, Somalia remains one of the world's most failed states, bar none. Al-Shabaab, the youth, is its jihadist vanguard, and any Somali outed as a Christian is beheaded. Is European colonialism really necessary to explain such continuity?